So, George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, in Pope's Creek, Virginia. His father was Augustine Washington and his mother was Mary Ball. George had 3 brothers. He had 3 half-brothers, 2 sisters, and a half-sister, and he was an Anglican and Episcopalian. I think that's how you say it. Anyways, fun fact, George Washington didn't have a middle name, and out of the first 20 presidents, only 5 did. Now, he wanted to join the Royal Army, but his mama said no. So, basically his half-brother Lawrence and the friend/mentor Colonel Fairfax came up with a plan to let the 14-year-old join. But good old Mama Mary didn't think this was a wise career choice, which actually ended up working in her favor. Yay, Mary! So, Washington was a surveyor for the county, a county that was new called Culpeper. Anyways, which he secured at a ripe old age of 16. He got that position because of the same Colonel Fairfax that was trying to get him into the Navy. During the year 1747, he was a surveyor for the unexplored Virginia wilderness. For anyone that doesn't know what a county surveyor is, it's a public official, and that means he administered the county land survey records, reestablished and maintained the official government survey monuments, and reviewed property boundary surveys and subdivision plans. Boom. So another fun fact, Washington contracted smallpox in 1751 during his one and only trip out of the country to Barbados. Now let's jump forward to 1754. Guess what started then? You're right, the French and Indian War. Guess who started this war? Actually, we don't really know because both sides claim that the other started firing shots. But our main man George's forces killed the most French soldiers and that were camping under rocks. Thanks to this little attack, the 7-Year War started, which was technically a world war, but we're not learning about that today. So not even a year into the battle, Washington surrendered. Wait, what? You heard me right. Washington surrendered at forced necessity, which happened on July 1st, 1754. So, not even a whole 2 months into the 7-Year War, Washington gave up. But I mean, he did save the lives of his men, so I guess that's admirable. The terms of the surrender were written in French and horribly translated, but basically Washington and his men could return home to Virginia peacefully and live another day. This is the only known time in history that Washington surrendered to the enemy. Fun fact! The surrender terms had a clause in it having Washington admit the assassination of Ensign Jumonville, which he wholeheartedly denied even though his signature was on the paper. Of course, this wasn't the only time that Washington was involved in the 7-Year War, which, BTW, started on May 28, 1754 and ended February 10, 1763, with Great Britain as victor over France and Spain. Do you hear wedding bells? Because that's right, we're jumping forward to 1759, January 6th to be exact, and the wedding day of good old George and his wife Martha. Martha was a widow with 2 kids when they got married, but she did bring enormous wealth, so there is that. But George and Martha were married for 40 years and never had kids, except the kids she already had. But don't be fooled. George Washington was actually very fond of kids, and there are rumors and speculations as to why he never planted his seed in Mary. But nothing was ever been confirmed. On that note though, no one specifies the rumors, just that there were some. In fact, Washington was an excellent dancer, and thanks to his growing social status, because he married Martha and into wealth, was invited to all of the balls, cotillions, parties, and dances. But even though Washington was in great physical shape, he had horrible dental health all of his adult life. Now, while I have your attention, let us get some things straight. Contrary to popular belief, his teeth were never made of wood. No one exactly knows where this rumor started, but some dental historians believe that it's because of all of his other dentures that were so stained and nasty that they looked and had the appearance of wood. Well, the ivory ones anyways, which his dentures were made of ivory, lead, I think, and some other often weird materials. But here's a little quote from his dentist. The set you sent me from Philadelphia was very black. Port wine being sour takes off the polish. Oh, by the way, John Greenwood was his dentist. In 1761, Washington inherited Mount Vernon after his half-brother Lawrence, the same one that tried to sneak him into the Royal Navy, passed away in 1752. In 1754, George was renting the estate from Anne, Lawrence's widow, who had already remarried and moved away. The mansion, as we know today, wasn't actually the original mansion. Washington oversaw 2 separate expansions, and he also designed them. So the mansion that we know today was designed by Mr. George. 2 more quick little facts before we jump forward. Washington not only owned 8,000 acres with just Mount Vernon, but he also owned 50,000 acres of what is known today as West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Kentucky, and the Ohio County. Second, towards the end of his life, Washington owned a rye and corn whiskey distillery, and in 1799 it had produced more than 10,942 gallons of whiskey. The year, 1775. June 15th. Washington is appointed the commander of the Continental Army. He probably wasn't the best commander, though, and lost more battles than he won. But his leadership is exactly what we needed to beat Great Britain's ass. I mean, we will talk about this more in a bit. In 1776, Washington won the Battle of Trenton, and in 1784, he beat Yorktown. We all know about the famous painting of Washington in his boat with his troops crossing the Delaware River. But does everyone know why? He did this so that his troops could attack the lone garrison of Hessian troops located in Trenton, New Jersey. His plan was to cross the river in 3 different spots, but he was the only one that made it across. Colonel Coldwater was supposed to lead 1,200 Philly troops and 600 Continentals across the Delaware near Burlington, New Jersey. And General Ewing was supposed to bring 800 Pennsylvanian troops across the river near Trenton and take up a fence along the Assunpink River and Bridge. They were supposed to be the ones to prevent the Hessians from retreating. Now, to be fair, even the most experienced of military wouldn't have been able to... they probably would have, but they would have had a very hard time executing this plan. Both Coldwater and Ewing failed at crossing the river, and Washington's trip was over 3 hours delayed. Now, let's talk about Washington's presidency and the Constitutional Convention. In 1787, the Union started falling apart. So, to save our young nation, George and 11 other delegates came together to form a new government. There are 5 major issues that were going on during this time, though. There was slavery, the representation, state versus federal powers, executive powers, and commerce. Now, the word slavery doesn't show up in the Constitution, but it did play a big part. So, with the 3/5 compromise, meaning that 60% of slaves in each state will count towards congressional representation, which in turn increased the number of southern seats. Because of this, the southern states agreed to stop importing slaves from Africa in 1808. So, Congress took it upon themselves to regulate the commercial aspects of slavery. Representation was another big issue during the Constitutional Convention because large states wanted representation by population, but the smaller states wanted equal representation per state. So, thanks to the Great Compromise, the House of Representatives and the Senate was born, and they were able to have representation that both the large and the small states wanted. Another big problem was that no one could agree if we wanted the Federation to have the majority of the power, or the states. So, many of the delegates believed that the federations should be able to overturn any state law, but logically, the others were worried that this might cause the federal government to oppress its citizens. So the compromise was made that the federal government would have a specific set of regulations and the rest was up to the state. Boom! Take that, government! Now, of course, the newly independent states were iffy about having another leader, considering that they just won the war against tyranny. There was about 60 votes before the delegates decided to put the Electoral College in place, but little to Washington's knowledge, he would become the first president because they trusted him the most. Everything always has to do with money. And it wasn't any different back then. The states wanted and had their own currencies, and even put state taxes on everything that crossed the state line. Washington, along with Madison and Hamilton, weren't digging this at all, and believed in promoting the free flow of commerce across state lines and nationalizing the economy, making it the great powerhouse we know today. Now, just so you know, there were 6 other people that helped draw up the Constitution. Obviously, our main man, George. We also had James Madison, George Mason, Roger Sherman, William Patterson, and James Wilson. I'm not going to talk about these cats in this video just because it would be forever long. Keep an eye peeled for their histories and the involvements in the history we know and love today. Dun, 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 dun. The first president of the United States of America. His inauguration was April 30th, 1789. He had 2 terms. His vice president was John Adams. His salary was $25,000, and he lived in New York and then later on Pennsylvania during his presidency. Most of his term was defining the executive branch and building our government. He set up the presidential cabinet. He appointed the entire Supreme Court. He also constructed the nation's first capital, and he set in place the Native American policy, put the whiskey tax in place, and had ratification of the Bill of Rights. So let's just mention a few of his other big accomplishments. In 1789, he was able to do the Judiciary Act, and he had North Carolina join the Union, which was the 12th state. And then in 1790, we had the Nationalization Act, the Residence Act, the Copyright Act, and Rhode Island joined the Union. State 13. In 1791, we had the Bank Act, the Excise Act on whiskey. Vermont State joined. In 1792, we had the Coinage Act, the Militia Acts, and Kentucky was added on as a state. Now, let's just explain that a little bit. The Judiciary Act established a 6-member Supreme Court and position of the Attorney General. Naturalization Act established rules to be followed in granting national citizenship. The Residence Act directed that the permanent federal capital be positioned along the Potomac River near Georgetown, the future Washington, D.C. The Copyright Act is the first federal copyright legislation designed for the encouragement of learning. The Bank Act created the first bank of the United States. The excise tax on whiskey, it was a measure levied a federal tax on domestic and imported alcohol, earmarked to offset a portion of the federal government's recent assumption of state debts. This highly unpopular tax led to the Whiskey Rebellion. The Coinage Act created the United States Mint and the dollar as our official currency. The Militia Acts was 2 acts that allowed the president to call out the militia when threatened by foreign or domestic threats and created a more uniform and regulated militia structure. Fun fact, President Washington's second inaugural speech was the shortest to date and was only 135 words. Fellow citizens, I am again called upon by the voice of my country to execute the functions of its chief magistrate. When the occasion proper for it shall arrive, I shall endeavor to express the high sense I entertain of this distinguished honor and of the confidence which has been reposed in me by the people of the United America. Previous to the execution of any official act of the President, the Constitution requires an oath of office. This oath I am now about to take, and in your presence, that if it shall be found during my administration of the government I have in any instance violated willingly or knowingly the injunctions thereof, I may, besides incurring constitutional punishment, be subject to the upbraiding who are now witnesses of the present solemn ceremony. The major accomplishments of his second term were the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Then in 1794 we had the Naval Act and the Slave Trade Act, and in 1795 we had the Naturalization Act, and finally Tennessee was the 16th state to be entered into the United States. Now let me explain those just a little bit as well. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a federal crime to assist an escaping slave and created a system that would return escaped slaves to his masters. The Naval Act ordered that 6 frigates be built for example, the USS Constitution, and created the United States Navy. The Slave Trade Act is a law that restricted American ships from participating in the Atlantic slave trade. Then the Naturalization Act established rules to be followed in granting national citizenship. So now remember, we had one before. So those were his big things that he was able to accomplish during his 2 terms, each term being 4 years long. Did it. Now, farewell, Mr. President. As we have learned, George was a badass from an early age and lived to the ripe age of 67. He died at approximately 10 p.m. on December 14th, 1799, due to acute bacterial, I'm gonna butcher this word again, epiglottitis. In his will, he made sure to free all of his slaves after his passing and was the only slave-owning president to do this. Now, when I say after his passing, he did write in his will for it to be after Martha dies. So she still had the slaves while she was alive, but then once she died, the slaves were freed. And even though he was to be buried under the Capitol, he rests in his home, his estate in Mount Vernon. Now, I don't know exactly why she did it. I don't know if it's because she was upset that she was a widow again. I don't know if it's because maybe she didn't love him. I'm completely speculating here, but I do know for a fact that Martha destroyed all of her letters from George, except 2 that were found fallen behind her desk after she passed away. It turns out that Mr. George was actually quite the romantic, and while he was out during the Revolutionary War, he sent her a letter, short, sweet, to the point, and he professed his love to her, stating that he retained an unalterable affection for her, which neither time nor distance can change.